I did a sculpt a day thing, and every day you got a challenge and you had to sculpt something in that day. Now January, if you remember, was a pretty busy month for most of us because we came back to school. We had a lot of work to do. So in my free time, one day I built this. So this took me probably about 3 hours to do. So I'm going to, there's not a whole lot of detail on the skin of him, just because again I had 3 hours to build this entire thing. But all the stuff that we're going to go over is going to be exactly the same. So one of the things is with ZBrush, when we're rendering stuff out, just like Maya, we don't have like a predetermined document size, right? So like in Maya, we just build stuff and then we tell it what we want to render out at. ZBrush is kind of weird how it has it set up. So I have to go to document and I have to specify my document size right here. So for yours, you're going to be doing a head. So you can change your settings to appropriate settings. So for like a head, where we're just doing a head, we're going to do it as an 8x10. So if we go to 3000 wide and we go to 2400 tall, or if you want to switch it around and go 2400 tall or 3000 wide, you could do that too, or the other way. Now, as I'm changing my stuff, you'll see that they keep changing each other. Because I have this constrained proportions clicked, it's doing that. So I'm just going to set my width to 2400 and the height to 3000. That works. Okay. So now this is my new size, but it doesn't automatically resize my stuff or render my stuff out like this. What I have to do is I have to tell it to resize my document. And when I do that, yes, it stretches out my character. Not a big deal, because all I have to do is just redraw the character back onto the screen and then go to my color and make sure I'm in edit mode. Go to my color and say clear, and that will clear out any of the other stuff that was laying on the bottom of it. Okay? Now, it looks like my screen shape didn't change at all. So my screen shape is still the same size. I need to see what it's actually going to look like. So I have to click this AA half, and what this does is it helps kind of fit it into the box. Okay? So now this is what's going to render is right inside here. So I'm just going to resize this and kind of get the guy positioned. Oops, wrong button. All right, so I'm going to resize it. You have to wait. And kind of reposition where it's at. Come on, right there. Okay, so that's where I'm going to render out my character at. So if I decide I render this out, it comes in too small, too big, I can always come back and just adjust it. Once it's there, it's kind of like, you know, right there. I've also turned my floor on, so this is not something that's on by default. I need to have that floor on so that it'll actually act as a ground plane, so I'll have shadows. If the floor is too small, I can make it bigger by going up to draw and taking the grid size and making this bigger. Okay? I could also play with, inside here, the angle of view. So if I wanted to add some distortion to my character, oops, make sure I turn perspective on. Distort some of this, kind of like if it was in an actual camera. I could kind of elongate some of these features and kind of change the look of this, just adding a little bit of perspective. And then again, kind of resizing that to fit it into the frame. Let's come on. There we go. Okay. All right, so under light, there are some lights here. You can play with lights if you need to. Typically, the default lighting is sufficient for what we're going to be doing. These are actually kind of tricky to work with because they're not very intuitive. Like as I move this around, if nothing's updating here, I actually have to go through and render it out in order for the stuff to update. Okay, so if you are getting weird light, just go up to the light and just move this light around until you get something that looks a little bit nicer. Like if you shoot it from the left and the entire right side is dark, move the light around to the other side so you can see what's actually happening. Okay? You could also play with the intensity. You could also add other lights simply by clicking on this. And you have to click it twice initially to get it going, and then click it once to turn it off. All right, so now I want to actually render it out. So I'm going to go to the render menu here, and there's a little swatch at the top where my arrow is at. So this little thing, if I click that, it docks the rendering view over here, so I don't have to constantly go back up to that render spot. So I'm going to go down to my render properties, And inside of this one, I've turned on shadows, so I get shadows. I've turned on ambient occlusion, so I get ambient occlusion. I've turned on subsurface scattering and transparency and wax preview because I want all of these things. I could also turn on depth Q, I could also turn on fog, and I could play with those settings. Everything that I turn on here has a menu underneath it for me to adjust how that's looking. So if I turn on depth Q, I can come down to depth Q and play what depth Q looks like, or adjust what the fog looks like. Think of this as an element. So as you take this rendering, you're going to bring it into Photoshop, and then you can tweak what it's going to look like inside of there. So with these, I'm just going to leave it just like that. Everything else looks good. Okay, so now I want to render this out to see what it looks like. So I click this BPR button. And when I click the BPR button, this is what actually does a rendering. Okay, and the rendering gets saved right to where we're looking at. Okay, so it's not like Maya where it renders it out to a folder. It saves it right here, and then we have to tell it I want to save my rendering and actually put it onto my computer. So right now it's thinking. You can see the rendering settings are going here. It's rendering my shadows. It's rendering all my stuff. The more items you have clicked over there, the more stuff it's going to be generating, the longer it's going to take. Okay? And we'll go through some of these settings as we progress with this. There's also fibers too, so if you had hair, like if you added hair to your character, you'd need to check fibers so that the fiber hair would render out as well. The goal with this is that we want to have several different ways that we can tweak this. So with our subsurface scattering, with our transparency, with our ambient occlusion, with wax preview, these things are just elements that will allow us to, after we get into Photoshop, tweak what the final image looks like. Okay? When we render it out of here, it's going to look decent, but we want it to look super duper awesome. So we need to play with the settings a little bit inside of Photoshop. So while that's going, let me jump to Photoshop, because I already have this kind of rendered out like that anyway. Not there, there. Okay, so once it's done rendering, I'll show you what the renderings, how we get these out of there. So these are all the different renderings that we're getting out of ZBrush. Okay, and then this one is my final image. Oops, that one. Where'd he go? Where'd he go? Final. There we go. So that's what I came up with at the end, taking all these elements and putting them together. Okay, so with this, this is my ambient occlusion. What this is going to do is it's going to track any areas where we have these really close spots. So anything where we have surfaces touching or very close, it's going to make those very dark, giving us a bit more depth on the character. For the beauty, this is just going to be the coloration of it. For the depth, it's going to measure from the camera to our character how far the character is. So right here, this hand is closer, so it's brighter. This hand is further away, so it's darker. And what we can do is we can use this kind of stuff for information for transparency or depth of field or any of that kind of stuff. Here's the floor depth. I typically don't use that. Here's the mask, so I can cut that character right out from the background. Here's the shadows. So this is all the shadow information that went into it. You can see there's some shadows down here and shadows on top of that. And then this is the subsurface scattering. And so what this does is it's giving us kind of like a little glow around the character. So if we had the character, let's say, in front of the sun, it would be neat to have the sun kind of wrapping around the character and having a little glow happen around the edges. That's what we can do with something like that. So let's see if ZBrush is done yet. It is. Cool. So inside of ZBrush, to get those out, I go to my BPR render pass, and here are all those different renderings that I just did. Okay, so here's all the different renderings. So I need to get them out, so I click on it, and then I can save this to my folder. So I'm just going to make a brand new folder, and then I call it what it is. So this is my shaded, so I just call that shaded. I go to my depth, I call it depth. I go to shadow, I go to AO, I go to mask, I go to SSS, and I don't use the floor, but we'll just save it anyway and go to floor. Okay, so let me close all these. Let me open up my new one. And you'll see that it came in at that size. So it's obviously bigger and rectangularly. If I go to my image size and I change this to pixels, you can see it's 2400 by 3000. Sometimes your screen still doesn't display it correctly. Like, that's how big he came in. So obviously I'd want to go through ZBrush again, zoom in closer on him, and render it out further. Even though this looks like it's pretty close, it's not showing the entire thing because I think my resolution is a bit off. So I would zoom in I said, on the character, even if it's like that, and then I would just render it out again and then save these things out again, okay? Now some things I can adjust. I'm going to go to the shadow. Oops, where's my shaded? There it is. Where's my shadow? Okay, we can see it on the shadow. If you look at the shadow, you can kind of see how the shadow looks a little bit spotty. It's actually not too horrible because in this file I've already adjusted it some. But sometimes your shadow will come in like horrible looking. So if I go under my shadow, typically this maximum angle is set to 0. And what that means is that you have one light and it's basically like a beam, like one single beam that shines in your character. So you get this really hard edged shadow going around it, okay? If you take that angle up, it spreads the shadow out, all right? Now, as you spread the shadow out with this, you need to add more rays to help smooth the shadow out, okay? So I should probably go, and I didn't do it for this one because I wanted it to go quicker, maybe make that 32 rays or 64 rays or 128, whatever it takes to kind of smooth that out, okay? So that's typically most of the tweaking that you'll have to do to that, all right? So now with this, I'm going to take all of these and I'm just going to copy it and paste it into my document here. And I'm going to grab my layers. Oops. And I'm just going to rename this to be my shadow. I'm going to grab this and copy it and paste it. And this will be my SSS. I'm going to copy it and paste it. And this will be my mask. And like I said, I'm probably not going to use that, but we just keep it there anyway. The reason we don't really use it is because I could generate that. I could just draw a gradient and have that same exact thing. So it's not really like I'm gaining anything by using it. Here's my depth. And then here's my AO. There we go. Okay. So now I need to actually implement these. So I'm going to go back to my shaded mode. And what I want to do is I want to cut this guy out of the background. So I have a mask. So I can use the mask to cut him out of it. Okay. So I'm going to grab the color information for the mask. I'm going to go down to my shaded mode. I'm going to put a layer mask on this. I'm going to alt click it and then paste that mask inside there. So I basically just taken that mask color information and pasted it on that layer so that when I click on the layer, now he's cut out of there. Now he's all by himself, and now I can do other stuff to get that to look the way I want it to look. So if I want the shadow to be on this, I'm going to turn the shadow on, and then I can take this normal mode and change it to multiply. And what it's going to do is it's going to add more shadow depth to the character. Okay? So you'll see how the character gets a bit more shadow inside of it. I'm going to brighten it up just so you can see it a little bit better on the projector. There we go. So now we can see it a little bit better on there. So now as I turn the shadow on and off, you can see how there's a bit more shadow stuff on there. Now the background keeps changing white because the shadow is like taking the white from that. So what I can do is create a clipping mask. So if I hold Alt between shadow and shaded and I click, it's going to limit this layer to just on here. Okay? So now the shadow only exists where that layer exists. So now as I click it on and off, I can definitely see more of that look. I'm going to drag my AO down here. I'm going to turn it on. I'm going to set it to multiply. And I'm going to do the same thing. Alt, click between them. And now I have the AO also enacting inside there. So there's the original. Here's with shadow and AO. Now it may seem a little bit too dark, like I'm getting a little bit too dark in the chin area, maybe a little bit too dark by the eyes, okay? Everything is tweakable, so all we're doing is kind of putting it on there as a flat right now. I can go to my opacity and knock the opacity down on my AO, and that will help minimize how much ambient occlusion is being added. Same thing with shadow. I can knock this down to help soften some of the shadow. I could also go into this, leave it all the way cranked up. I could put a layer mask on each one of these, and then using my brush, just paint black where I don't want that to be affecting things. So I don't want the AO right here under the chin, so I could just paint that away. Okay, so I'm basically just painting black on the layer mask, which erases that ambient occlusion from there. Go to shadow, put a layer mask, there we go. Okay, so now again, I'm tweaking what this is looking like based on the stuff that I have. And if I see an area that's maybe a little bit too dark, I'm just hitting it with a little bit of black just to kind of erase that color information. There we go. Okay, so again, we'll look at the before, look at the after. We're definitely getting some nice depth in here by adding these in there. All right, so now I'm going to find an image. Oops, not you. Happy Teacher's Day. No one told me. Thank you very much.
I saw the graduation hat thing outside for one of the lots, maybe.
Yeah, it's not ours. I'm going to Google Images. I'm searching for something I can reuse with modification because I'm going to be modifying it. And I want to find something that's appropriate to my character. So let's say something like... I got to find a bigger picture too. Let me go to my size and just make this bigger. Remember, we're 2400 by 3000, so something like 8 megapixels is a pretty decent size. Alright, we'll just say we'll use that one. That looks like a nice picture. Even though it looks like it's poison greens. What it said. Alright, so I'm going to save the picture, and just for now, I'm throwing it on my desktop. You obviously would save it into your folder. And then I'm going to open up that image. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to paste it. Oops, not there. Paste it there. And then I can hit Control-T and just kind of move it around and resize it to get me the shape I want. And get me the proper area that I want. So maybe something like that. And I'm just going to drop it below my character, so now he's kind of like inside the view. Maybe I'll tweak the colors because obviously he's not as green as the background is. So I can go to my color adjustments. I can go to my, I'll try hue and saturation. And maybe I'll take this more over to like that. There you go. I'll leave it just like that. Okay. And then I could take all of these. Okay. I haven't used any of those ones yet. Actually, all of these. I'll take all of these images here, and if I go to my move tool, I can move this wherever I need him to be, or I can hit Control-T and scale them up a bit and resize all these layers just so it kind of fits. Now, you're only working with the head, you're not working with the whole body, so your placement's going to be a little bit different than mine. We hit enter and wait and wait and wait. There we go. Okay. Then what I can do is I'm going to take the Subsurface Scattering one. This is the one we talked about adding a little bit of glow around it. And I'm going to do the same thing that I want to do with the other ones. So I'm going to turn that off for a second. I'm going to go down here and add a, I'll add a curves. And what I'm doing is brightening up the entire image. So I'm going to limit it just to my character. So I just make a clipping mask. But I don't want it to be on the whole character, obviously. I just want it to be around the areas of the edges of the character. So I go to my Subsurface Scattering. I copy that layer. I go to my mask for this curves, and I paste it in there. And so now, if we look at this, you'll see that that is only affecting the edges, making the edges kind of glow a little bit more. And as I go into this, I can play with this to darken the edges or brighten the edges. I can use the same thing if I wanted to give some sort of different coloration, I can go to hue and saturation, do the same thing, tweak colors, whatever. Okay, I didn't end up using my floor one, like I said I probably wouldn't, and I didn't end up using the depth one. With something like the head, something like this body, not a whole lot of stuff that you need to use the depth with. This is more for something where we have a more intricate shaped object, okay, or more dynamically depth of field character. If my character is holding an apple or something and I want that depth to show the apple crystal clear and the character kind of fuzzy, that's where I would use that depth of field. But with this, it's pretty straightforward. So what I'm going to do, just set that down there, is I'm going to take my character stuff. I'm going to take this background first, and I'm just going to add a exposure to this and just knock the exposure down. Okay. Now this obviously darkened the entire back image, but I'm going to go to my exposure. I'm going to paint with black, and that's going to hide the exposure. So I'm hiding the exposure. What? I'm on black. I'm on this.
He's bloody.
He is bloody. Brush.
He's a killer.
Oh, I clicked something. There we go. So I'm on the exposure, and now I'm painting, and what it's doing is it's creating a vignette. It's helping darken those edges and bringing our focus right to the center of our character. So you can see how it just softly hits those edges. Maybe I'll take the opacity down a little bit on that. There we go. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is just take everything in this picture, Control-Shift-C it, and then paste it above. And now I have basically like a locked out version of the character exactly as they are, and then I can add a blur to them. So I'm going to go to my iris blur, and this is a really neat tool because it allows me to isolate where my blurs are. So I'm going to say let's blur this entire thing like that, and then I'm going to hold down Alt and just kind of drag these little manipulators closer to the center body. And what those do is that they keep him in focus and they blur out those edges. So now if we look at it, you'll see we have some fake depth of field. So that wasn't like real depth of field, it's actually measuring how far he is from the camera. It's just blurring the edges a bit. And so here's the blurry version and the crystal clear version. You can see how much nicer that blurry one looks. It looks a little bit more realistic in what we're looking at. Okay, typically you don't want to blur the eyes. We always look at the eyes, so we leave those alone. We could do more enhancements on this too. We could go into, let's say, hue and saturation. We could shift our colors. Oops, maybe not like that. Okay, so I can kind of shift the colors a little bit with this. I could also go into like photo filter, and I could put a cooling filter on this if I needed to, or a warming filter, or pick a color. And then I could tweak what this is looking like from there too. Okay? So there's lots of different things that we can do to tweak this after we got it. And that's the point. That's what we're doing, taking it from ZBrush into Photoshop to tweak. So now I'm going to save this, and I'm just going to save it as Sarcona Final Character. Now when you save it, make sure you save all your layers, because I want to see this kind of stuff. I want to see what your Photoshop looks like. I want to see that you've tweaked it, manipulated it, beyond just the ZBrush stuff, okay? All right, and that's it. That's how you take it from ZBrush, render it out, and bring it in. There's nothing crazy with it. The only thing you may have to adjust is maybe moving some of your lights around and then adjusting your shadow angle and your shadow rays. Everything else should be kind of standard as how far it's set up. Okay, any questions on the character stuff?